So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
Welcome to our weekly marriage hour here on Trending. It's great to be with you, and as we discuss marriage and more, first, a piece on a story that we've been covering here on Trending pretty regularly, surprisingly, and that is Britney Spears. We just talked about her 2 days ago. We were talking about the wild obsession over Britney Spears, whether or not she converted to Catholicism. You can catch up on that. We'll post a link in the show notes, and also we'll post that on social media as well, link to that show. But here's the latest news. Today, her father, that is Britney Spears' father, Jamie Spears, has agreed to step down as one of the conservators who's been overseeing her life for the last 13 years. If you've not followed the story, we've been discussing the Free Britney movement, how her father has had an intense amount of control over her finances, over her performing, over her social media, according to Britney Spears, even over whether or not she can have an IUD, that is a form of a barrier form implanted in a woman's body of contraception that functions to prevent new life from beginning. And also we've seen so many cases where this has led to abortions as well for women. And ultimately what we've seen is that Britney wants to be freed. She's even claimed she wants to not only have her IUD removed, but she wants to get married, among other things. And so this is one more step for the Free Britney movement. And I just think, as I was pondering this today, a moment to pray for Britney Spears and her whole family, especially for that father-daughter relationship. I can't even imagine how strained that entire situation must be for the father to step in to begin with, believing that his daughter, if justifiably so, needed him to take conservatorship over her entire life, now for 13 years. And now for her, wanting to be pulled out from underneath her father's thumb, saying that he's violated and abused the conservatorship. That's what we'll probably see in the year to come. It's been a couple year-long battle, and ever since Britney in July of this year claimed that not only does she want her father to no longer be the conservator, but that he was abusive in his power as conservator, now we will see that continue to play out in the year to come. And I pray for healing for that family, for Britney Spears, that she's able to move on with her life in the best way possible for her. And if she did convert to Catholicism, I pray that this brings about an even greater conversion in her life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. Joining me in just a little bit will be Father David Michael Moses, and we're going to be diving into the topic of discernment, discerning marriage versus religious life. And we'll even discuss how marriage is actually the natural vocation that all of us are oriented toward and usually think we are called to. We'll discuss that, and also how to discern, and at the end of the day, how do you decide the right person to marry? Also, it's the feast day of Saint Jane Frances de Chantal. If you don't know, she's actually a saint who was married. Her husband died when she was 28 years old, leaving her with 4 surviving children. And I'll tell you who she was close friends with. Big surprise, another saint. And we'll pull from some of the wisdom she has in the letters that she wrote to many people, one of which including her daughter, and giving her daughter marital guidance. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. Topic I want to dive into for just a moment. I was reading this story about how many young conservative emerging leaders have been encouraged at a recent institute, that is the Intercollegiate Studies Institute conference. They've actually been encouraged, if they want to change the world, change political life, they're being told to, get this, get married and start a family. Now, it's fascinating. In some of the presentations that occurred at the institute, one of the speakers actually commented about how it's interesting that we can actually tell that there's something going on. John Zimmerek had commented that, in fact, many people are asking this question, having to do with whether or not this current life is worth passing on. He said it's a sober, unfalsified vote count of what our citizens think about life in our country. That is, when people aren't having kids. He said, do they think it's worth passing along? Or must we rely on strangers coming in and replacing our culture with their own? So what John Zimmerach's getting at is people aren't having babies, fewer people are getting married. And is this telling, in terms of the society, that people aren't having kids and getting married because they don't think A, maybe life's worth living, or B, that it's worth giving to other people? You know, it's fascinating because I'm a millennial, and my generation, it's reported that over a quarter of my generation, more than 1 in 4 of us, will never get married. When I say never get married, never get married. In fact, I know many people who are completely ditching the marriage scene. They're not interested anymore. They've ditched the dating scene. They've become jaded, tired of looking, and outright overwhelmed by the lack of options available. So this is a challenge of the modern culture. What will happen? Well, as we're seeing some emerging leaders, not just religious spheres, but actually in the political sphere as well, are being told, get married, have families. This reminds me a little bit of St. Mother Teresa. St. Mother Teresa, when she commented actually during her Nobel Peace Prize speech, she commented telling people to go home and love their families. Now, the context of this is much more robust. She's talking about how if we want to change the world, start on a micro level and move to the macro level. Start in our homes, start in our neighborhoods. Go out from there. You don't have to travel across the world or across your country in order to find someone in need. And so this is a similar attitude that now even politicians are jumping on the bandwagon of. If you want to change the pro-life movement, you want to change this trend towards gender ideology, you want to see new faith alive in the people today, but even more so tomorrow, start a family. Change the course of history by embarking on a journey with someone else to cooperate with God in creating new life. And as Catholics, taking on that marital responsibility of having children and raising them. And raising them well, raising them in the Christian tradition, with virtue, with prayer. This is what people are being told to do. A message that we've heard for quite some time within the Catholic Church. Have families. Love your children. Again, raise them in the church. We need to stop accepting the narrative that there are no men attending church for women to find to marry. We need to stop seeing this narrative that over a quarter of my generation, the millennial generation, will never marry. Take back our country. Take back the great faith that we have to offer other people. Take back these friendships that are longing to be cultivated but aren't being cultivated because we've lost a culture of community, cooperation, of life-giving, self-giving love that's seen predominantly within the context of marriage, witnessed and taught to children, and lived out in friendships and ultimately in the new families that are created. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. As I mentioned, the big news this afternoon, Britney Spears' father, Jamie Spears, has stepped down, or says he will step down, from the conservatorship he has over her. We've been covering the Free Britney story. We'll post links on social media to this week's latest development of the question regarding, is she Catholic? What's up with her announcement she posted on social media that then she later took down? You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. My guest joining me today during our weekly marriage hour is Father David Michael Moses. He grew up in Texas. He's only 28 years old and is quite an incredible priest. He'll share with us a little bit more about what he's up to, as we will also discuss a little bit of his story. We'll dive into the topic of discerning marriage versus religious vocation and how to discern if this person is the right person for you to marry. Welcome to Trending, Father David Michael.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
So share with us a little bit, for you're new to our audience here, a little bit of what you're up to, and then I'd like to dive into discernment, marriage versus religious life.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm Father David Michael. I was just ordained 2 years ago here in Houston, Texas for the Archdiocese. And I'm now what's called a parochial vicar, which is like the assistant priest at the newest parish in our Archdiocese called St. Faustina. So it's just about 7 years old. 7 years ago, they sent the pastor out here with a piece of land and told him to start a Catholic church. And now 7 years later, we have 13,000 parishioners. So it's
Wow.
been really cool for me the last couple of years just to see it grow. And it's especially unique because it's such a young parish. So 50% of our parish population is under the age of 20. So like half
Wow,
of our
that's
parishioners
incredible.
are kids and half our priests are
Fantastic.
kids. That's kind of my joke. So it's just a beautiful place to be with a lot of life. And it's been such a gift for me, my first couple years of priesthood to serve here.
Fabulous. Now, fun fact about Father David Michael, I actually have you beat. This is something not a lot of people know. You started college when you were 14. Now, I started
Yeah,
taking
yeah.
college courses when I was 13, but you beat me because you actually
Ah.
graduated with your degree when you were 18. I came and went with college courses starting at 13. Share a little bit about how this maybe influenced your vocation later on.
Yeah, well, you just edged me out. But it was fun. I'm sure, like I appreciated kind of having a unique educational path. My parents were always kind of looking for creative ways to challenge us, and so starting college young was just kind of something we decided to try out, and it seemed to work well, and definitely gave me some different options um, in terms of what I wanted to do with my life, and definitely felt like the Lord was calling me to priesthood ultimately. Although I was looking at law school and things like that at the time as well.
Let's dive into the topic of discerning marriage versus religious life. It's a fascinating topic. So many of us, especially if we're Catholic, we should contemplate this at some point, not just write off a religious vocation or even just write off a marriage ultimately. Let's dive into how you discern the priesthood versus marriage. What did that look like for you?
Yeah, yeah. So I grew up in a good, solid Catholic family. I was the fifth of six kids, which is a good place to be because, by the time your parents have their fifth kid, they don't care as much anymore. So you have a little bit more freedom. But I always had a good example of what, a faithful marriage looked like in my parents, and always assumed I would get married. Um, Whenever I was an altar growing up, whenever people would say like, "Oh, you'd be such a cute little priest," I'd always say like, "I like girls." That's not going to happen. And I really thought that because I liked girls, that meant that I definitely wasn't supposed to be a priest. So it wasn't until I went on a silent retreat when I was 16. It was the Ignatian spiritual exercises for about 48 hours over the course of a weekend. That just in the silence and the prayer, I felt the Lord saying, "It might be you. I'm calling to be a priest. It might be you." And that kind of rocked me a little bit. And I remember telling the priest on the retreat, like, I'm kind of feeling called to the priesthood, but I really like girls, and I don't know what to do about that. And he said, "Hey, that's totally normal. That's totally natural. But God still might be calling you, and if He is, you have to take that seriously." So I really took those next 2 years to take it to prayer and to go to daily mass, and really fell in love with how a priest could help people, specifically through the Eucharistic confession, to literally be able to give people Jesus in the Eucharist, and to literally be able to absolve them of their sins in the person of Christ in the sacrament of reconciliation. I just thought, like, what more could I do for somebody than that? But alongside that was still this fear about being celibate for the rest of your life. 16, 17, 18, that sounds like an insane thing to do, and it,
Right.
it kind of is. I had dated there was a lot of cute girls in the youth group at the time when I was in high school, and I dated one girl for a couple of months. She ended up breaking up with me for one of my best friends. Turns out she was more into ugly guys. That's what I say to make myself feel better. And then I dated this other girl for about a year, and it was a great relationship. And we went to daily mass together all the time. But ultimately, I still felt that voice, in my heart, the Lord saying, "I want something else for you." And so I remember having to have that conversation with her. And even when you're 17, that's tough, in your parents' front yard. And she was crying. It was hard, but I really felt like I had
Heartbreaker.
to, yeah, I had to be true to what the Lord wanted. So I contacted the vocation director, started the application process. Things were going well. And then about halfway through, just got really nervous about the celibacy thing again.
Mm.
And so I remember at one point, in my discernment, I had read that you could ask God for a sign. You could ask him for a sign. So I had called the vocations director and said, I was kind of feeling anxious. And he said, why don't you come downtown and talk to me about what you're feeling? So I was driving downtown. I was thinking about the sign thing. I just thought, okay, God, how about if you want me to go into seminary, send me a dove. Send me a dove. So I'm driving around town and I see some birds. I'm not really sure if they're doves. And then I
You're
realized
scoping
I don't
them
really know
out.
what a dove looks like. I don't even know what a dove looks like. Like I'm not a dermatologist, okay? So I really should have picked something more obvious, but I didn't think I saw any. So I talked to the vocations director and he said, if it's the Holy Spirit, you really shouldn't feel anxiety. You should be feeling peace. So take a break from discerning seminary and really discern law school. As we mentioned earlier, I was graduating from college at that point. So I've been accepted to some law schools and was definitely looking at that. And so I took those next couple of months just to isolate the discernment. That's a really helpful thing to do when we're discerning things, as opposed to just having tons of things on the table, to isolate it down to one thing at a time, maybe to bring before the Lord. And so I really tried to focus on law school. And for this next 2 months, I prayed about that a lot. Eventually, I was at a holy hour at my home parish praying about it, and I just did not feel drawn to law school. And I was feeling drawn to the priesthood again, but the celibacy thing was still on the table. And I just thought, gosh, Lord, I want to do whatever you want, but I just need to know what that is. Like, I'm willing to do whatever. You know my
I have a
fears, you know my
question
anxieties.
I
Yeah.
have a question about the celibacy question. Is it just the cultural pull where like this just didn't seem something realistic, normal? Did it seem impossible? Did you think you weren't capable of it? What was the hang up with the celibacy idea?
Oh, that is such a good question. I have told this story a million times and no one's ever asked that. That's such a good question. Yeah. I think it was beyond, obviously culturally it is kind of expected you're going to get married, but I grew up in a good Catholic family. We were okay being countercultural. And in terms of actually being celibate, I was very confident I had the grace to do that the Lord would give me that, to live a chaste life. I was doing that. And I felt like I could do that. I was honestly just concerned about being unhappy, being really lonely and being really unhappy. That
Oh,
was my fear with the celibacy.
that's
And
profound because it had nothing to do necessarily with the word sex, like everyone's thinking, like how, so many people look at priests like, how can you
mm,
suppress that desire? But in reality, it had to do with friendship, companionship at the end of the day.
yeah, certainly you're a man and you have those attractions, but any man in today's world needs to be able to control those, right? I mean, when from the point you hit puberty to the time you get married is probably going to be 8, 9, 10 years, whatever. You have to be able to control those desires, especially today, like with pornography, things like that. It's sadly so
Right.
widespread. But you have to be able to integrate that. Everybody needs to be able to live a celibate life at some point, and especially in their adolescence. So yeah, I felt like I could do that, although the attraction was definitely there in a strong way. It was really more about, yeah, just kind of going through life alone, not having that just one person that you were with, you know. And then certainly I think, especially my time in seminary, the idea of never having kids starts to come out a little bit more too, right? Not having that like physical fatherhood coming out is
Right.
something that I think is present as well.
Mm.
So yeah, thanks for that question. That is such a good clarification.
Yeah.
That's definitely where I was at, where my fear was. And so I asked God again in that moment. I was like, I just want to know, I just want to do what you want. If you want me to go into seminary, send me a dove, send me a dove. And right then I looked up and realized that the huge painted glass window above the altar was a giant dove as a symbol of the Holy
Boom.
Spirit. And I thought, okay, fair enough, God. I think
Praise
that's
the
what I
Lord.
need to at least take this next step, And obviously, the discernment doesn't end when you enter seminary. It was a 7-year process, and especially those first 3, 4, 5 years, the celibacy thing was still forefront of my discernment, a lot of my prayer. But over time, especially experiencing more and more ministry in the parish, I really felt like, okay, this is something that's worth giving my life to, and these people, these parishioners are worth being celibate for. This is why I'd be celibate, to be able to give myself entirely to the Lord, entirely to my people. And once you experience the fruit of celibacy, it starts to make a lot more sense. We talk about it as a gift, celibacy being a gift, and that doesn't mean like, oh, Merry Christmas, what did you get? I got celibacy. It's not a gift like that, but it is a gift in terms of it's helping me get what I'm destined for, which is God, right? It's helping me get to God. It's sanctifying me. It's sanctifying my people. Um, And even though, like, as a 17-year-old, I remember telling God, like, can you just have anything else? Can you take anything else besides, the fact that I want to get married and have a family? And he never forced me, but he said, would you be willing to give that up for me? Yeah. And of course, when the Lord invites you to something like that, it's hard not to say yes, and
Isn't
say,
it?
yeah, you take it
Yeah.
all.
Isn't it a powerful sense of freedom? I've heard some of my friends who chose the religious life that at a certain moment when they realize, like, I don't have to become a priest and I also don't have to get married and have a child. I can do whatever I desire here.
Right.
And it's almost overwhelming, that opportunity for freedom at times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that because we can get a little bit caught up in this prison of like, I hope I hit the bullseye of God's will, when really God created you free with a mind, a beautiful mind to be able to think through things and pray through things and then make decisions and make commitments. And that's the only way that commitment really means much, is if it was a free choice, like a free gift of self. And so I'm thankful that I never felt that pressure from God or my family or really anybody, that it was always an invitation from the Lord to give myself in this way. And to be able to respond to that really is really what it's all about.
Okay, I have a follow-up question as we're talking about marriage versus religious life and discerning that. How do you think now, your concern with regard to celibacy and some of your trepidation with becoming a priest really had to do with friendship? Now that you're a priest, how would you say friendships are for you? Has it been challenging? Has God provided an abundance? What's it been like?
Oh, that's a great question too. No, yeah, that's a really important thing. As a priest, I'm called to be celibate, but I'm not called to not love, right? I'm not called to just be alone all the time, especially as a Dawson priest in a parish. So I have experienced a lot of graces, from friendships with men and with women. I have a lot of close friends who are men and women, and there's so much good there. And I think that's important, especially like when I talk with people who might be struggling with same-sex attraction, to say, hey, you are called to a celibate life for sure, but that does not mean you're called to just a lonely life, or you're called to a life without love or a life without friendship. Our culture so often equates love with something sexual, or like if you have a close friendship, it assumes that it will become sexual at some point, and that's just not true. It's not true. In fact, sometimes the greatest love always the greatest love is a sacrificial love, right? That it's not self-seeking. So to have disinterested friendships, disinterested mean you're not seeking something out of it. It really is something that you're giving, is a really good thing. And I think our culture really needs to reclaim that. So for me as a priest, yes, certainly I am celibate and committed to that, but I still need to have good friendships.
Amen. That's Father David and Michael here on Trending with Timmerie. We're going to come back and we'll briefly discuss why marriage is the natural vocation and religious life is the supernatural vocation. We'll discuss the calling, the pull, and we'll also discuss how to discern the right person to marry. We'll be right back during our weekly marriage hour. It's also the feast of St. Jane Frances de Chantal, and we'll discuss a letter she wrote to her daughter giving her advice about her marriage. Catholic Order of Foresters is proud to sponsor the Relevant Radio Studio line. For information about employment opportunities and flexible premium life insurance plans, visit relevantradio.com/Forester.
Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
It's the feast day of St. Jane Frances de Chantal, and if you didn't know, she was actually a saint who was married. I'll tell you much more about her story, but we're going to walk through a letter that she wrote to her daughter giving her advice about marriage. What does a saint have to say about marriage? What do people say about her marriage? We'll discuss that and more here during our weekly marriage hour. Joining me now is Father David Michael Moses, and we've been discussing really how to discern marriage versus a religious vocation, and we're going to discuss how to discern the right person to marry. But before we go to that, Father David Michael, I wanted to touch briefly. I read a book years ago when I was in college. It's called Religious Vocation, An Unnecessary Mystery by Father Richard Butler. It was a fantastic book, and it oversimplified it to such an extent that I remember when I was in college, I decided I think I have a religious vocation, and it really broke down in part kind of this understanding that yes, marriage is the natural vocation. All of us think and feel called to marriage. Our bodies have this complementarity, male and female. We have desires and hormones and puberty and everything that we go through, along with this desire for companionship and friendship that you emphasize that was at the core of what you were concerned about with regard to entering into the seminary and becoming a priest. And so this natural calling toward marriage is so strong, but we also don't think about the supernatural call that, as St. Paul and even the apostles themselves came to this conclusion of understanding, why would someone get married if we're meant to be with God? St. Paul himself emphasized, don't get married. Just keep it simple. You and God. Why would you bring other people into that to make it harder? And so there's the natural calling, but then the supernatural calling, both of which can be overly simplified, but also provide a simple path forward in understanding and discerning as well, I think.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And like you said, they're both such good things, right? I mean, to be married is such a good thing. To be a priest is such a good thing. Neither of those is sinful. And certainly there's a lot of principles to keep in mind that, yeah, there's going to be no marriage in heaven. So there isn't a situation in which if the Lord is calling you to that celibate life, what a gift that is. But also marriage is, if you're called to that, that's going to be your vehicle to heaven, So it's important that people, be intentional about how they're discerning the two and make sure that they're following the right one. But it's definitely difficult, and it can be frustrating. It's all about how you're going to give yourself, right? How you're going to choose to love, how you're going to sacrifice, because certainly both are going to have real sacrificial elements. I was at a family's house for dinner the other night. They have 6 kids, and one of the dad told me that the oldest daughter, I think she's 7, he overheard her praying one night, God, please be with mommy. You gave her 6 kids and she's stressed. And I just love that, that even, that little girl knew that, hey, God had given them a lot to handle, but he was going to give them the grace to the vocation to deal with that. So certainly, yeah, everybody's going to be naturally drawn, to marriage because it's such a good thing, but we have to be listening if the Lord is inviting us to something deeper and to a deeper unity with him.
You mentioned earlier that you ended up ending a dating relationship when you decided that you're really discerning the priesthood. How important do you think dating is while discerning the priesthood?
Yeah, well, like I said before, isolating the discernment process is really helpful. So if a guy is really serious about priesthood, he's going lots of discernment retreats, probably isn't a good time to be dating. You probably want to take some time to kind of isolate the discernment. But naturally, dating can be a really good way to get to know somebody and see if they would be someone you're going to want to try to get to heaven with. But it definitely depends on what you mean by dating, right? In today's world, dating can have all kinds of terrible connotations, and you want to make sure you're focused on the right things, right? That you're getting to know the person, what their goals are, what they really want out of life, which hopefully is going to be holiness and sainthood. What their vision is for a family, how they align with church teaching and the will of God. But if dating, if done well, is going to be, crucial for making sure that you're marrying the right person.
And you could always get yourself in trouble. My now husband and I were both discerning religious life at the time when we started dating. In fact, I was discerning. There was a running joke among some of my friends because they knew that I had kind of decided, okay, I want to become a nun, but I want to, finish college, go to grad school, get my PhD, and then I'll go that way. And I had kind of made this decision, of course, making my own plans. And at the time, I think something was wrong with my car, and my now husband, just a friend, was helping me out. He drove me to the car dealership to help me get it checked in, and he shared with me he was discerning the priesthood. And I'm sitting here going, oh my gosh, what a jerk. He's dating my friend right now. How can you discern both at once? And so finally I said, okay, I've got to say something. how can you be dating my friend and also discerning? And he's like, well, actually, we've not been dating for a couple of months. We're just not talking about it because small school, big drama. And of course, it was a ton of drama when we started dating. But, it's just so funny because, like, I think sometimes you make plans because you've decided what you want, but you're not always taking it the right way to our Lord. Or because you're open to our Lord, he's going to completely transform what you have intended as well. And so I think that this discernment is such an important part, even as you're approaching dating and marriage. So let's talk a little bit more about marrying the right person. How do you discern marrying the right person? You're 28, you've been a priest for 2 years. You, I imagine, have been going through marriage prep with young couples. What do you think are some of the most important things for discerning the right person to marry?
Yeah, it's a huge question. And it is funny because, yeah, I am really young, and I joke at the beginning of weddings, I'm about to preach to you guys about marriage because I'm 27, I'm celibate, and I saw a movie about it once. It's like you wouldn't think I would know much about it, and I certainly don't know any firsthand. But through confessions and through meeting with people in marriage preparation, you do see a lot of different relationships. So I might, hopefully have something helpful to offer, people in that regard. The first thing, this is one of the best things I've heard. I heard it from a Baptist preacher. He said, definitely worry about finding the right person, but also make sure that you are the right person, right? So we all want somebody who's
Mm-hmm.
holy, who has a good prayer life, who is kind and gentle and charitable. Are we trying to be that person ourselves? Are we trying to
Amen.
be somebody that we would want to marry, right? And I think another preacher I heard say the Bible doesn't necessarily show you how to find the right person, but it does show you how to be the right person. So spend some time with Scripture. Make sure you're close to the sacraments. Get to know the person of Jesus. Make sure that you're the kind of person you would want to marry. The other thing I always tell people is, you and I were talking earlier about it being a free choice, right? It's not as if God is going to force you to marry anybody. It's good to remember, hey, this is one that you choose. I tell people, like, you didn't choose your mom, you didn't choose your dad or your siblings. If you have a difficult relationship with any of them, hey, you have to work through it, right? This is your family. You have to deal with it. The person you marry, your husband or your wife, that's one you get to choose. That's one you get to decide yourself. So make sure you freely choose the actual one that you want, right? Don't ever think that just because you've been dating somebody for a long time, that you have to just kind of go through with it, or think this is just the best I can get, or I know he doesn't go to church, but he knows my favorite restaurants. It's important to say, what do you actually want? Because you get to choose. And then you're the one that has to live with them. It's nobody else. For me as a priest, I'll talk to young people. I'm not the one marrying you, like I don't have to deal with who your husband is or your wife is, but you do. So choose one that you actually want, because it does pain me whenever I meet with people who have, married somebody that they thought might not be the right person, and then turned out to be a real struggle. And certainly there's still grace in the sacrament, and you're called to stay faithful, and the Lord will work through that for your sanctification.
Amen.
And you also don't know where marriage is going to go. So often people get married and there can be tragedies and accidents and things can go wrong. But if the person is making it pretty clear to you what their priorities are, don't marry them and then be surprised where their priorities are when they showed you before
Yeah.
what their priorities were. It's a very common thing, but don't marry the person expecting that they're going to change in some way, or that you're going to fix them. Marry the person you think is going to help you get to heaven, the person that you really want. And then that goes along, we were talking about dating earlier, that if every day you spend dating somebody who is not the right one to marry is a day that you're not meeting the person who you need to be marrying. Don't spend more time and energy getting into something that ultimately is not going to be what you truly want,
Amen. And just a note on
marriage.
that,
Yeah,
because I
please.
think it's important, and that's Father David Michael joining us now here on Trending with Timmerie. If you're dating someone and this isn't the one, you're not sure, and you're dragging it out, don't waste a woman's fertile years. And I think that's really important to say. So many women years later are so frustrated and hurt because someone wasted those years, and then they're at a point where they're not as capable of having children. And at the same time, like, ladies, don't crush a man's heart to the point where he's no longer interested in dating because you drug him on for years and you were just using him for a companion.
Hey, that's a great point. We think a lot about, making sure you're not wasting your own time, but even more importantly, not wasting the other person's time. And that goes certainly with marriage and fertility, but also if they're called to the priesthood or religious life, they need to be moving on with that too, whatever it is, for them to just be kind of just wandering around in a relationship is not going to be helpful for them. And I do tell people too, hey, like as a celibate person, I can say firsthand, it's better to be celibate than to be married to the wrong person, right? Because in 30 years, you're not going to care as much about the fact that y'all dated for 3 years or whatever that you invested. You're going to care a lot more about what that situation looks like right then. And really, I think even though it's a natural vocation, to get married is kind of an insane thing to do. And to stand up in front of a group of people and tell this other person, I will love you no matter what, is kind of crazy. And that's exactly why it's so beautiful, because you're really playing the role that God plays with us, the way he says, I will love you no matter what. It's a crazy thing to do, but as human beings, in like the imperfect way that we can, we mirror that love of God by entering into that. And that's what makes it beautiful, but make sure you don't enter into that not without an awareness of what's happening. And certainly as a priest, it's something similar. To give your life to God, to give it to the church is a wild thing to do. So don't do it without a pretty healthy sense of what it is that you're taking on.
Amen. A couple things that came to mind when we were discussing how to discern the right person to marry. I think first, for me, being Catholic was a deal breaker. If you weren't Catholic, that was important. But there are a lot of people, and we've actually discussed this during our marriage hour, were you willing to marry someone who wasn't Catholic? It was a fascinating conversation. We heard so many people's stories. In fact, we'll post a link to that on social media and in the show notes for the podcast today. But even if you're not willing, if Catholicism isn't a deal breaker, having at least someone who is seeking truth. And I think at the same time, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Father David Michael, someone that challenges your holiness for the better, not negatively. So often I see people get married to someone who is maybe not the greatest Catholic or has no creed whatsoever, and they challenge the person who's Catholic, but not in a positive way. And then here you are almost missionary dating and exhausting yourself every day because you're insisting on trying to fit this together into a relationship. And like you said, you're the person at the end of the day who's with them every day and you're married to them.
Yeah, I mean, marriage should be the other person challenging you to holiness. So if it's like the exact opposite of that, like they're bringing you down, then that's a huge red flag. And yes, certainly them not being Catholic is not a deal breaker. I can say personally, before I was a priest, I never would have married anybody who wasn't, simply because that's what I really, wanted. But, I do weddings for people who are non-Catholic, even people who are non-Christian. But I think like you were saying, somebody who's seeking truth, I think it's important to ask if the person if they don't have a relationship with the Lord, with Jesus, if they don't have a moral compass, then where do you expect them to fall on all these really important issues, right? Throughout your relationship, even, I mean, to speak frankly, something like pornography or something, if they don't have a sense of right and wrong, what do you expect as you're entering into a dating relationship, an engagement relationship, and then a marriage relationship, if they don't have a sense of what good and evil are? Some of that might take some time to uncover, and not to say that Catholics can't have a lot of temptations and struggles they're working through as well. But there's certainly a difference there that's worth considering. And
Right.
and always with discernment, kind of like you were pointing out, don't waste your time doing something you know is wrong. If you know it's not a good fit, and that goes for a relationship or anything, if you know it's wrong, stop. Do something else, because there are other good things out there. There are other good people out there that you're keeping yourself from.
Amen. And we had a caller call in and share, Elizabeth from Kingston, New York, to pray for the person that God is preparing for you and how important it is that you are the person for that person. Pray that you recognize one another. This is such an important prayer. And if you're single, you're searching for a spouse, know that I'm praying for you. We're going to employ Father David Michael to pray for you as well if you're listening right now. Father David Michael, it's been great having you here during our weekly marriage hour on Trending. You can follow him on social media, especially Instagram. He has a YouTube channel as well. We'll tag him on Instagram. Head over to @Timmerie, Timmerie on Instagram to follow and find Father David Michael in my story. I'll be back in just a moment talking about our saint, who is in fact a saint who was married. Don't go away.
We're talking about what you're thinking about. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Welcome back to our weekly marriage hour here on Trending. If there's something you would like to hear discussed, reach out. We'd love to hear from you. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Head over to relevantradio.com/trending. You can contact me, connect on social media, especially the Instagram, and you can subscribe and share this episode. Maybe you know someone who's discerning marriage, discerning dating, they're discerning the religious life. We had Father David Michael on with us discussing this. Now, today is a feast day of Saint Jane Frances de Chantal. And if you didn't know this, she's actually one of the saints who was married. So often, more often than not, majority of the saints were never married. Says something, right? But this saint was. Her husband Christopher, however, died when she was 28, leaving her with her 4 surviving children. She had 3 children that did not make it past infancy. Now, a contemporary and in fact a close friend and partner in great holy work was St. Frances de Sales. After her husband died, she was introduced to St. Frances de Sales, and together with St. Frances de Sales, they founded what is even now an existing religious order for women, that is the Visitation Sisters. Now, as I mentioned, St. Jane Frances de Chantal was married. She had 4 children, one of whom died fighting for the king. She was a French saint. And one of her daughters in particular, there are a number of letters that we have where she wrote back and forth to her daughter, among many other people. There's an incredible work, and it's actually available for free online. I'll have to post that on social media. They're the selected letters of St. Jane Frances de Chantal, tons of letters. And what's cool when you read letters from saints, you see not only the sanctity, the holiness, the profound advice, but you also see and are reminded of the humanity of a saint. Or maybe they're struggling with something still. Maybe there's something in particular that people are trying to work through. You see, this is what's so, I think, special about keeping this incredible amount of documentation from the saints. And those are some letters. We'll share that on social media. But let's walk through a couple of the letters. We'll come to a letter that she wrote to her daughter. But first, I want to share something about a witness for the cause for her canonization. Something that this witness brought up in the canonization process for St. Jane Frances de Chantal. She commented about St. Jane's marriage to her husband Christopher. This witness said these 2 spouses provided a model of a genuinely holy marriage. They had between them one heart and one soul. I thought this was a very profound statement that was brought up at St. Jane Frances de Chantal's canonization process. Why? Because this summarizes exactly what God calls man and wife, husband and wife too, from the very beginning of creation, Genesis chapter 2, when God tells Adam and Eve, male and female, the call that all of us receive, that we're meant to leave our home, leave father and mother, and that we get married, and that the two become one flesh. And so often when we think about the two becoming one flesh, you have a bunch of teenagers who giggle when you read this passage, but the reality is it's so much more than the complementarity of the bodies and intimacy. This is a profound intimacy of heart, soul, mind, and this is something that we see witnessed from this witness who knew and understood St. Jane Frances de Chantal and her husband Christopher. That even though they had such a short marriage, that her husband died when she was only 28 years old, that they had such a profound marriage, that they truly were, it was said about them, they had between them one heart and one soul. This should be a goal for our marriages, that we have the goal of holiness, that we have each other's best interests in mind, and that we truly set one another before ourselves with a perspective that we are called with that person to the procreation and education of children, to the union of spouses, ultimately that union to culminate with both spouses ending in heaven, and that's done through the work of the complementarity of the two. Now, in one of her letters, St. Jane Frances de Chantal wrote to her daughter, who is, in fact, they're actually quite the family. Her daughter was a countess. Her husband, that is St. Jane Frances de Chantal's husband, was a baron, so she was a baroness, I believe. That's how it would go. In her letter to her daughter, there's this one point where it's written that St. Jane Frances has heard that her daughter, the Countess, has now, and this is all real, even though we don't have countesses per se the way that they did back in the day, it's just an honorary role now, not as lived out, doesn't mean this is some fairy tale story. And I think it's important that we remember that. So what happens is it's discovered that her daughter's pregnant. This is great, exciting news. But St. Jane Frances de Chantal recognized that her daughter, and in fact commented on a couple of occasions, that she had to kind of remind her daughter not to be almost kind of frivolous in her attitudes and overly focusing on all of the external and extra things. That is the ways of the world, essentially. So she's talking to her daughter about this new baby, and she reminds her daughter to thank God for the prosperity that she has enjoyed thanks to God. And she then goes on to implore her daughter not to be employed in pomp and this culture of constant vain display, but to make her advance in holy humility and loving fear of God. Holy humility and loving fear of God. How easy is it when we, have exciting news about ourselves, great accomplishments, even joyful occasions, to be somewhat pompous and vain and display it for others to see? I wonder what St. Jane Frances de Chantal would actually say about social media today. She'd probably, and I want us all to kind of listen to this within that context, she'd probably tell us to stop being pompous and vain on display all the time and to be humble in a holy way, lovingly fearing God, not always displaying things the way we tend to display things. And she knew for her daughter this was a temptation to focus on all the extra in life and to be distracted, and that she herself, St. Jane Frances de Chantal, she would write to her friends about this, to pray for her children, especially her daughter, who were basically distracted by the world. And St. Jane Frances would even comment about how one of the greatest things that she could desire is that her children go to heaven. And she would write about this in her correspondence to her friends. But I also want to dive into some of the guidance that St. Jane Frances de Chantal, a saint, a married saint, ends up giving to her daughter, having to do with marriage and specifically how she approaches her husband. It's fascinating in this letter. She encourages her daughter in a particular way to pay particular attention to her husband. She in fact says, I advise you to fulfill all your duties toward your husband as God ordains. So what is St. Jane Frances de Chantal emphasizing? That God ordained an order within marriage, a cooperation and a complementarity, male and female, husband and wife. And she's actually telling her daughter, I advise you to fulfill all your duties toward your husband. So maybe her daughter was struggling. Maybe her daughter at times was wanting to check out. was wanting to be distracted by the ways of the world. And in fact, this brings me just briefly, I want to make a comment here because I was thinking about this the other day. It's so easy and common in the 21st century for women to say they don't really enjoy taking care of their kids. They don't really like their kids that much. That, they really don't want to be around their children or be home very often. It's something that's commonly said and in fact commonly accepted. But pause for just a moment and imagine if a husband were to say, I don't really like my kids that much, or I really don't enjoy taking care of them. I really don't like being around them. We as a culture are horrified and disgusted by any man who would say this. But yet we think it's okay if a woman thinks, says, and feels that way. I'm just bringing it up for a moment because for some reason we've completely allowed for this detachment of mothers from their children rather than fostering and helping to heal whatever confusion, wound, or allurement of the world is present. That's what we should be doing. But instead we say that's okay. Yet when a man says it, we're like, that's wrong, and we just call it for what it is and move along. So think about that within the context of this particular letter. St. Jane Frances de Chantal is turning to her daughter, and she's advising her daughter to fulfill all her duties toward her husband as God ordained. Remember, duties toward your spouse have to do with duties in cooperation and complementarity toward your children as well. Now, St. Jane Frances de Chantal, in her letter to her daughter, says, this I advise, I now reiterate. So she made it clear that she would say it over and over again to her daughter in her upbringing. Notice, if you're a parent who has a child who's not really sticking with her faith or struggling in her marriage, know that St. Jane Frances de Chantal raised her children right, but even then saw her children struggling. And so let St. Jane Frances de Chantal's advice be a solace and a reminder for parents, and also a guide for all of us as we work through our marriages and future marriages. St. Jane Frances de Chantal, pray for us. Coming up tomorrow, Dr. Susan Caldwell, a fertility and infertility specialist here on Trending.